Assalamu alaikum dear students, and welcome back to the fourth lecture. In this lecture we would be covering various topics that are associated to lecture number 3 that we have already discussed, and I welcome you back to see the importance of public finance, glide through various lectures that are being presented. In the last lecture we discussed the positive and normative economic perspective, as well as in lecture before that we established the welfare economic criteria of Pareto optimality. Then in the third lecture we discussed the efficiency criteria again, and we discussed that how marginal social benefit equals marginal social cost in a perfect market. Then we discussed the various effects of market failures and what types of market failures can take place. And having that discussion, we also discussed the equity and efficiency criteria. In this current lecture, we would be taking it one step further when we would be discussing the market externalities. I have already highlighted in my previous lecture that market externalities are a very important source of distortion in the market. What are market externalities? That would be explained in few minutes. But first, let us take up a topic of, for example, an environmental issue, which is pollution. Now, if everybody considers that they have the right to clean air and clean water, and they have the right to breathe that clean air and clean water, and but some people attach have more attachment to this environmental issue and consider it a moral on moral grounds and a moral issue, but be sure that it is more of an economic issue in which there is allocation of resources, and the markets might result into an allocation of resources which might produce pollution, and there is a marginal cost, private cost and social cost to that issue. Because everybody has the right to breathe healthy air, and reduction of pollution would cause better health and lesser cost on medical treatment. But the point is that here comes the dilemma, that if we want to curtail the environmental pollution generated by the industries, we might also in the end curtail the production of goods and services. If we want to completely halt the environment being polluted, we would be out of goods and services being produced by industries. So that would stop the mechanics of the machinery of the industry. Different governments, specifically in the developed countries, have passed various laws to control the issue of environmental pollution by carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and generally carbon emission, which has resulted into very humongous steps in curtailing the pollution issue and to reducing the carbon emission level in the overall and global level. We would be discussing this and also consider that firms and governments spend millions of dollars to correct this environmental issue. Now, whenever buyers and sellers take part in an activity which result into an effect on the third party, that is called an externality, and pollution is one of the examples of the externality. Now, moving on with this lecture, we would be basically focusing on externalities and public policies, and we would by the end of this lecture, we would convert or take up the theory to the actual policy on ground. This is one of the most interesting topics that I have come through during the study of public policy, and I believe that you would be interested in this topic too, because it is one of the prime topics, prime issues that affects every one of us. Now, externality, while discussing this, we would be discussing what are externalities, what is the effect of externalities on efficiency, and how they are interrelated, the complex interplay within themselves. Then the concept of internalization of externality. Internalization of externality would mean how to reduce the effects of that externality. That can be done through corrective taxes, second best efficiency theory or efficiency solution, corrective subsidies, property rights and cause theorem, efficient abatement level, and regulatory solutions. Maybe in this, and we might include another lecture for this to cover all these topics, or maybe we can finish them in like this one complete session. But it is, keep in mind that it is a very important topic, and your interest would develop as we move on in this lecture. Now, the main question is, what are externalities? Externalities are costs or benefits of market transactions not reflected in the prices. Now, whenever two groups, buyer and seller, interact in the market, there is a possibility that the third party is affected by their interaction among themselves. Now, whenever the third party is affected by their interaction, that is an externality. An externality is specifically when the cost or benefit of that interaction is not accounted for in the private costs or marginal social cost and marginal social benefits of the interaction of producer and seller. The externalities are broadly or basically of two types. Negative externalities are the cost to the third parties. Its example would be, the ideal example would be pollution, for example air pollution. Like some people do not opt for maybe purchase of a car, or do not opt to buy some good from the industry, but still that industry is producing pollution, and that car is emitting carbon, specifically carbon monoxide, and in that case every individual or the third parties who is affected by these things, they have a negative externality. And whenever it is a negative externality, and whenever the cost of this externality is not, this external cost is not included in the total social cost, it is termed as negative externality. Another example can be, for example, with expansion of cities in urban areas. People often move closer to the airports. Now, people living in surroundings of the airports are disturbed by the noise pollution created by low-flying aircrafts. Now, it is highly possible that an individual is not like a part of that regular travelers on that plane, but he is affected by the noise pollution. Now, that also has a cost to it in terms of social cost, and since that cost is not included in the interaction between the passengers and the airliner, that would mean that there is a negative externality. Then there are positive externalities, or the benefits to the third parties. Positive externality would be in terms of, for example, in terms of fire alarms. If some individual purchases a fire alarm and installs it at their home, people living in surroundings also benefit from that, because because fire alarms curtail the expansion of fire. So there is a benefit to all the other people living in the surroundings who do not even use the fire alarms. So in that case, since the cost of the fire alarm, or the price of the deal between the fire alarm making company and the individual does not account for this externality, this social benefit, marginal social benefit of one single fire alarm installed in my home, that would mean that it is an externality. Then another example can be, for example, if I get a vaccination. Now, if I get a vaccination for maybe flu, and that would protect me from that disease, but if it protects me from that disease, it also takes me out of the potential carriers of that disease. So there is a lesser chance of people being infected through me. So those people who have not received vaccination also benefit from my myself being vaccinated. So this would mean that there is again a positive externality included in this, because the price of the vaccine does not include that benefit to the general public surrounding me. Then there are another two types of real and pecuniary externalities. Whenever, for example, let's consider that there is an individual who is in the hobby of taking photographs. For that, he needs to buy the equipment. Now, in cases where there is an excess demand of that product and the supply is yet to be available, the prices of equipment would increase, and that would actually decrease the real income of the individual. But that effect was actually due to the supply and demand relationship of the equipment, and not just because of an externality of his hobby or other people's hobby. So other people's demand for that product also affected this individual, but this was due to supply and demand relationship, and this type of externality is named as pecuniary externality. And all the other types of externalities in which the cost or benefit of purchase of a product or purchase of a service or a product is not included in terms of marginal cost and marginal benefit, all those externalities are real externalities. Now, the marginal external cost is the dollar value of the cost to third parties from the production or consumption of an additional unit of good. This occurs when there is a negative externality. First, we would be covering and discussing the negative externality, and then we would move towards the positive externality. So the marginal external cost in terms of dollar value, which is the cost to the third parties, from the production and consumption of an additional unit of a good from the first and second party, and that marginal external cost is an externality, a negative externality, if it is not included. So if for example, as I said earlier, as I explained, that an individual is, let's assume that I buy a car. Now, when I buy a car, that is a deal between myself and the producer. For example, you do not use a car, and the carbon emission from my car affects your environment, or it causes air pollution, and obviously that affects you through air pollution. Now, that is a negative externality, because our deal between me and the producer of the car affects you, the third party. You are not involved in our transaction. So the price, the marginal, the external cost in the dollar value of the air pollution towards you should be included in the marginal private cost. Now, so that is marginal external cost to the external environment. And when marginal, so the whole concept is that the total marginal social cost should include marginal private cost and marginal external cost. Now, in this graph, let us assume an example in order to explain the market equilibrium, a negative externality and efficiency. Now, on the x-axis, let's assume that there is a paper producing company. It produces like millions of tons of paper per year, and then there is price of that paper, benefit in terms of dollars and cost in terms of dollar. Let's assume that at the given moment the demand curve represents marginal social benefit and the supply curve represents marginal private costs. And the equilibrium is the point where the price is defined at rupees or dollars 100. Now in this case, the output being produced is 5 million tons of paper per year, but then the waste from this paper producing firm goes to, for example, a lake. They pollute that lake, and that is a negative externality towards people who go there for excursion. So there is a cost, an external cost involved in terms of pollution that is taking place in that lake. So if we consider that negative externality, now one thing I want to make very clear over here, that calculating the dollar value of externality in terms of marginal external cost is a very difficult, it is a very huge debate, because for example, how would you calculate the cost of pollution? How what would be the total sources of pollution? Would it just like my firm that is producing pollution, or is it like all the firms, and how would you divide that cost of pollution? How much I am contributing towards the pollution and how much the other firm is producing towards pollution, and that would account for a total pollution. And even the natural scientists are debate on these issues among themselves as well, so it is very difficult to associate an external cost. But still, for this analysis, we would consider that we actually know the external cost, which is in this case like $10 for polluting that lake, and then we assume that we have another assumption in this case, that that external cost remains constant over the quantity being produced. Normally, if we produced more quantity, the pollution would increase. But to simplify our analysis, we would consider for now that the external cost is constant at $10 per ton per year. So if they if 5 tons per year is being produced, and the cost is $100, then if we consider the marginal external cost, it would be the total social cost would be 110. Now you see that as long as marginal social cost is equal to marginal private cost, there is no issue in the efficiency, because marginal private cost would be equal to marginal social cost, and marginal social cost when equal to marginal social benefit, that is the efficiency criteria which we discussed in the last lecture. Now what happens over here is that when external costs which are not accounted for in the total social cost are added, the marginal private cost is no longer equal to the marginal social cost, because there is some difference which is $10 over here. So marginal external cost when added to marginal private cost, that would be the total marginal social cost. So the marginal social cost after adding that externality is $110. So now since the curve has shifted upwards, you can see the first marginal private S is equal to marginal private cost, which is sort of a purple colored curve, and it has shifted upwards toward the left of the axis of x-axis. Now the marginal private cost also includes marginal external cost, and the total is marginal social cost, and there is a new equilibrium in the market which is at 0.4, 0.5. Why there is a new equilibrium? Because at the point where the price is 110 and quantity is 5, the marginal social cost exceeds the marginal social benefit. Whenever we discuss that again and again, like few times, I hope you remember that whenever marginal social cost exceeds marginal social benefit, it is beneficial to reduce the quantity being produced, and it's vice versa. Like whenever marginal social benefit is greater than marginal social cost, it pays to increase the total quantity being produced. So based on that, because we are taking the current analysis of the externalities based on all the discussions we had in lecture number 3, I guess. So if you are not up to it, then go and watch lecture number 3 again, and then come back and have a look at this one. You would understand. So we need to have marginal social cost equal to marginal social benefit, right? In presence of any negative externality, the lower supply curve and the demand curve intersect, and the price is decided at $100. marginal social benefit is equal to marginal social cost. But when the negative externality is accounted for in terms of dollar value, we assign a value of $10. We say that every ton of production every year they add $10 to the pollution in terms of monetary value to the lake, this paper producing industry. When they add $10, the price increases to 110, and at the quantity of 5 million tons of paper per year, marginal social cost is greater than marginal social benefit. So it would be much beneficial to reduce the quantity being produced to 4.5 million tons per year, and the price would be 105. So this is how, in terms of market equilibrium, a negative, whenever the marginal external cost is included, the market turns to an efficient market. Before this, when this cost was not included, the market was not efficient. It was producing more quantity that was required of it. Now when marginal external cost is added, the quantity is reduced from 5 to 4.5 million tons of paper per year, and the price increased from 100 to 105, considering now the price includes the negative externality inside. This concept is called internalizing the externality, and this can be done by actions of the government, which we would discuss over here. Now the graph clearly shows that the $10 was a negative externality, and this gap between G and A can be reduced if the output is reduced. Unless the output is reduced, this negative externality does exist, because marginal social cost is greater than marginal social benefit. In other words, G is above A, equivalent to a distance of $10. Now if these mechanisms can be corrected, which we would discuss very soon, but just as an example, we can tax this producer for tons for excess production, and that would reduce the production and point towards efficiency. Now market equilibrium occurs where marginal private cost is equal to marginal social benefit. That is fine as long as marginal private cost is equal to marginal social cost, but in this case it is not. There exists a negative externality equivalent to some $10 marginal external cost. Now when that marginal external cost is added into marginal private cost, that is the total marginal social cost. Now when that marginal social cost is equal to marginal social benefit, then that is the point of equilibrium, and which in this case, in the previous graph we have seen, resulted into the price of $105 per $105, and the quantity was reduced to 4.5 tons of paper per year in millions. Now then there is a positive externality. The marginal external benefit is the dollar value of the benefit to third party from an additional unit of production of consumption of a good. This occurs when there is a positive externality. When there is an external benefit, marginal external benefit towards a third party, which is not accounted for in the transaction between buyer and seller, then that external benefit is the marginal external benefit, and when that is not included, then there exists a positive externality, and when we include that in marginal external benefit, that is called internalizing the positive externality, which we would discuss very soon later on. We gave two examples for this. One example was an installation of a fire alarm at my home. If I install a fire alarm at my home, I would not just be benefiting myself, but by curtailing the spread of fire around the block or maybe around the city, I would be benefiting the society as a whole. So there is a marginal external benefit to that. Secondly, if I get vaccinated for some disease, then I would not be a potential carrier in the future. If I'm not potential carrier in the future, then I would be causing a reduction in the disease, and maybe in some later year a total elimination, and I would be causing that, one of the individuals who is causing that, so that would also benefit those people who have not been vaccinated, because they are not in potential risk because of me. And another thing, that there is one of the potential carriers in terms of me has been eliminated from the total number of potential carriers. Now, so there exists a marginal external benefit to all those individuals who have not been vaccinated, or those who have not installed fire alarm in their homes. Now, so in terms of marginal social benefit, the marginal social benefit would be equal to marginal private benefit, that is my benefit, plus the marginal external benefit, that is, for example, might be your benefit. Now, in terms of a graphical analysis, I propose that we look at this example in terms of the vaccination. Yeah, exactly, that is what it is. I hope you understand the negative externality. I hope you understand the concept of marginal private benefit. I hope you understand the concept of marginal private benefit and marginal external cost. When we add them together, that is marginal social benefit. Private benefit would be for me, and social benefit would be for the society as a whole. Now, in this case, in this example, in this graphical analysis, there is a supply curve, and a supply curve for available for inoculations, I would call it injections, for example, per year in millions. Now, number of vaccines, number of units of vaccines being produced, they are called inoculations. Now, on x-axis, there is the quantity being produced of inoculations per year, or quantity being available in the market and for consumption. And on the y-axis, there is price, benefit and cost in terms of dollars. Now, we need to see the effect of positive externality on the market efficiency. Now, let's assume that the original supply curve, which is supply is equal to marginal social cost, and demand is equal to, which is the downward sloping curve, is equal to marginal social benefit. Now, the demand curve is the marginal social benefit. First, consider the demand curve, which is intersecting at point U, and that is producing 10 million injections per year at the price of $25. Now, at this point, we are not considering the positive externality or the marginal external benefit, and we are only considering the marginal private benefit, and we are equating marginal private benefit is equal to marginal social cost. But when we find out that there is a positive externality associated with this $25 of vaccine or injection that is vaccinated to an individual, and that is again, as I expressed before, in terms of that individual being not a potential carrier anymore, and that individual not creating risk for others anymore. So in that case, there is an external benefit involved, and in this example, we weight that external benefit in terms of $20. So at point U, the previous point of equilibrium, the quantity being produced is 10. Now, when there is a positive externality equal to 20, the total price should be $45 per injection. Now, in this case, there is a positive externality, and the marginal social benefit, which is represented by Z at this point, which is the sum of marginal private benefit plus marginal external benefit, is at point Z at this moment. So, and the price is 45. Now, at this point, marginal social benefit is greater than marginal social cost. So, I hope now you are repeating before me, what is the effect on the market when marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal social cost? I hope you are repeating after me. Okay, marginal social benefit, whenever marginal social benefit is greater than marginal social cost, the result would be we need to increase the output, right? there is room for increase in the output. So the output would increase to the point V. We would discuss that later, how government can intervene in here, because we have already discussed that government can intervene to correct the market systems or market failures. That would come up later. But in this case specifically, the due point of equilibrium would be point V, where marginal social benefit would be equal to marginal social cost. And at this point 12 million injections per year would be produced, and the area ZUV is the positive externality which have been incorporated at point V, which existed previously but it was not incorporated for. But when we consider marginal external benefit, we find out that at point Z there is an positive externality which should be incorporated into price of the product. Now, there can be certain cases where marginal external benefit declines with the annual output being produced. Now, let us assume one of these cases over here in which we make an assumption. Let's start with the marginal private benefit curve, which is a downward sloping demand curve represented by a red line. And there is marginal social cost curve represented by S and red line, and intersecting marginal private benefit curve at point A. Now at point A, the price is currently $25, just like the previous example. But if we consider an marginal external benefit, the marginal external benefit is declining with the number of with increase in the annual output, because when more and more number of people are vaccinated, the total economic or social benefit reduces with that, because there are chances, because there is lesser risk of being affected by that disease. So marginal social benefit, in fact marginal external benefit declines with the quantity being produced, and marginal social benefit is a downward sloping curve. So this this brownish colored line represents, which is intersecting marginal private benefit, and it is intersecting marginal social cost at point B. So in this case, it would be, for example, the previous point of equilibrium was at 12, and in this case it would be at point B. But later on, what we need to highlight over here is that there is, if we increase the production to, for example, 16 million and onwards, there would be no need for internalizing the marginal external benefit, because with the diminishing marginal external benefit, it would vanish to zero, and the result would be again the marginal private benefit curve. So instead of trying to internalize it, if we increase the quantity being produced to 16 million injections or 20 million injections, the result would be that we do not need to incorporate, so only the supply curve needs to be shifted towards right. The new marginal social cost curve would be intersecting at 20 million injections per year. In this case, marginal external benefit would be zero, and marginal private benefit would be equal to marginal social benefit. So we have concluded that market efficiency can be increased if we charge the price of 20 and increase the supply of the product and 20 million injections. Now, moving on, I was again and again mentioning the concept of internalization of the externalities. An externality can be internalized if there is a policy that causes market participants to account for the cost of benefits, account for the cost or benefits of their actions. Now, whatever the case may be, if we can take it up somehow, like all the parties involved, the first party, the second party which are taking up the transaction, and the third party, if we can somehow account for the mechanism in such a way that the first and second party realize the external cost or external benefit involved, and then the transaction is carried out, then only then the market can be made efficient, just like in the previous examples where we considered a negative externality and we considered a positive externality. In terms of negative externality, there was pollution. In case of pollution, we considered that the total cost, the marginal social cost, would be equal to marginal private cost plus the external cost of pollution, and that since that increased, the marginal social cost increased, was more than marginal social benefit, it was better to make the market efficient by reducing the quantity being produced. And then in the second case, in terms of positive externality, there was marginal external benefit, and in such a case, when there is external marginal benefit, the solution would be that since marginal private benefit plus marginal external benefit was greater than marginal social cost, so we need to increase the output that is being produced. Now, what if in certain cases the government can intervene in the system, and with the intervention of the government we can we can internalize the externality by making the market participants or the first and second party account for the marginal external cost or the marginal external benefit in case of positive or a negative externality. Now, in that case, the requirement would be to identify the market participants. Identification of market participants is not always that simple. Identification of market participants would be to identify the first, second party, third party, or whatever number of parties are involved. Now, and the second requirement of this case would be to assign a monetary value of external cost or benefit. Now, monetary value of external cost or benefit is, again, as I mentioned earlier, is a difficult thing to measure. How would you account for, how would you assign a monetary value to the level of pollution in air or in water maybe? So it is very difficult to assign a monetary value to external cost or benefits. So the main controversy is basically the identification of the participants that are to be involved, and then the monetary value assigned to external cost or benefit, because in terms of environment its ownership is debatable. Then if individuals have the right to clean air, then firms producing the goods need to pollute the lake and air for the goods being produced for the masses of the society. And secondly, assigning the monetary value, because the scientists themselves are in debate about what would be the cost of pollution actually. So there is a deep controversy surrounding these two requirements through which we can internalize the externalities. Moving on, in order to, as when we were discussing the negative externality, we discussed that what would be the mechanisms by the government to correct that negative externality. Remember, negative externality is the case in which the external cost is not accounted for in the transaction between the two parties. The effect on the third parties is not accounted for, in fact. So what the government can do is setting a tax equal to marginal external cost will internalize a negative externality. If they can calculate the marginal external cost, they can apply a tax exactly equal to the marginal external cost, and that would result into the system turning back to efficiency. Now, here is a graphical example of the same case which we discussed earlier, and at that time I specifically mentioned that we would come to the internalizing this externality. Now, one of the ways to internalize a negative externality is a corrective tax, for example. Now, in this graphical example, there is, on x-axis there are tons of paper being produced per year, and then there is price benefit and cost in terms of dollars on the y-axis. The example, I would narrate the example again. We were discussing a paper producing firm which started to pollute the lake. Now there was an external cost for the lake pollution for people who used to go there for excursions. Now in that case there is a marginal external cost for that. If we do not account for that external cost, it would be a negative externality. Now just look at the point A where the demand curve, which is marginal social benefit, intersects the supply curve, which is marginal private cost. Now at point A, the negative externality is not accounted for. Over there, in the last example, we considered an example of a marginal external cost of $10, and we said that there is a requirement of internalizing that external cost. So we added marginal private cost with marginal external cost, and we came up to with total marginal social cost of $110. And at that $110, the quantity, the marginal social cost was at point G, and it was above marginal social benefit. That's why the quantity was reduced to the point where the equilibrium was at price of $105, and the quantity reduced from 5 to 4.5 tons of paper per year. Now in this case, what if the government could tax exactly equal to marginal external cost? In that case, the new supply curve would be marginal private cost plus the tax would be equal to the total marginal social cost. All we have done over here in this graph is replaced the marginal marginal external cost with the tax, with the T representing the tax by the government. A similar example, the same example, but with tax instead of marginal external cost. In this case, the new supply curve would shift towards the left, and the new equilibrium point would be at point B. The result would be the same as in that case, because in this case the total output has been reduced from 5 to 4.5, and the total cost has been the total price has been is being charged at 105 at the new point of equilibrium, which is B. Now in this case, there is a net gain in the well-being. The area represented by the triangle represented by G, B and A represents the net gain in well-being to the society as a whole. Now plus with this tax, there is an added advantage of tax revenue, which is equal to total external cost, and that is represented by between 105 and 95 and between point A, and represented by a T with parenthesis. This total tax revenue would go to the government, of course, and the government can utilize this tax revenue, for example, to clean that lake, or to fund like production of construction of parks for the excursions, and to benefit the affectees in some way. Now, results of a corrective tax were socially optimal level of productions are achieved. That mean when we explained it earlier without the term of tax, we said that if marginal external cost is accounted for, the quantity should be reduced from 5 million tons of paper to 4.5 million tons of paper, which was the same and which was declared as efficient output, because at that output again marginal social benefit was equal to marginal social cost, and the same thing was achieved by a tax, in which case the marginal social benefit was again equal to marginal social cost, and but in this case marginal social cost was equal to marginal private cost plus the tax. And we had specifically mentioned that the government should tax exactly equal to the marginal external cost. That was the main point of this discussion. Now the tax revenue is sufficient to pay cost to third parties, which is $45 million in the case in this case. Alternative methods of dumping, adding marginal external cost to marginal private cost. There can be for example regulatory actions by the government also, apart from the tax, but this discussion is on tax, but there can also be a discussion in which alternative methods of dumping can be explored, or maybe to reduce the marginal external cost back to marginal private cost. Now, a policy supported by one group and not the other group would mean that in this case, when the tax is being applied on the paper producer, that would not, because the paper producer can claim that they themselves have the right to pollute because they are producing necessary goods. While on the other hand, the rights of the excursion individuals going on excursions to the lake cannot also be challenged that easily, that they do not have a right to clean water and clean air in that area. Now the whole point is that this discussion would come up again when we would be discussing the property rights, and we would see that there are methods other than corrective taxes which would correct such distortions or market failures. Now, in United States, there is the greenhouse effect and a carbon tax. The greenhouse effect is generally caused by burning carbon-based fuels. Now, these carbon-based fuels accumulate into the atmosphere and contain the environment, which has started to result into the global warming. Now, this is called the greenhouse effect. Now, in order to control this greenhouse effect, there is a carbon tax being applied. If it is accepted that the greenhouse effect is caused by burning carbon-based fuels, a carbon tax can be imposed to limit greenhouse gases to their socially optimal level. It is called a carbon tax because the amount of tax would depend on the amount of carbon in the fuel. Now, again, this scenario is a very debated issue. Now, it is on one end the society would bear a higher cost due to environment damage in future. There would be more extensive damage, there would be health issues, there would be medical treatment costs, and so if the environment is completely deteriorated in the future over the longer term, then who would measure the cost of that? I mean, marginal social cost would be too great to account for that. Now, if we tax it a lot, if the tax is increased based on the increased risk of higher cost in the future, then the producers would need to either switch to alternative means of production, or they would switch to other goods to avoid the use of coal, like for example other types of fuel which would have lesser amount of carbon emission. Now, in that case, that would increase the demand for other types of fuel and increase their prices. And once the prices are increased, that would increase the prices of goods being produced by the producers, and so there would be a higher cost towards that. So evaluating both the benefits, which party is the loser and which party is the gainer, and how much we discussed this in the last lecture, that there was a compensation criteria. If the dollar value of gain by the gainers is greater than the dollar value of loss by the losers, then the government or it is supported to support the gainers and then compensate the losers out of their gains. But in this case, the topic is very debatable, because the losses of the environment it is very difficult to correct them by making payments. But later on we would see that the governments have taken steps to correct the market in this case where environment is being polluted. Then there is a dilemma further, theory of the second best, which we would discuss right now. Let us consider the dilemma that there is a polluting entity and that entity is a monopolist. Now, earlier we showed that a monopolist create a loss to the society. How? Because monopolist produces, I would just re-narrate that for you to remind it. the optimal level of production would be where marginal social cost should be equal to marginal social benefit. But the monopolist produces the quantity where marginal social cost is equal to marginal revenue, or his marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. From there he decides the quantity, but the price is charged equal to his demand curve, which is marginal social benefit. So in short, he produces a monopolist quantity at which marginal social benefit is greater than marginal social cost, and it would pay to increase that cost. So we also, apart from, now keep this on one side of your head, and then let us discuss the second one. Negative externality also causes a loss as well. Negative externality would mean, for example, there is pollution in the environment, and there is marginal external cost to it, and then that cost is added to marginal private cost. The total marginal social cost would be greater than marginal benefit, and when marginal social cost is greater than the marginal benefit, it would pay to reduce the quantity. So I hope you see the dilemma over here. On one hand, there is a monopoly in which the market is not operating efficiently, and in order to make it efficient, you need to increase the quantity it produces, so that marginal social cost is equal to marginal social benefit. On the other hand, that monopoly is polluting in the environment. If that monopoly is polluting in the environment, there is a negative externality. In case of a negative externality, it would pay the government to reduce, it would benefit the government to reduce the quantity being produced. So there is a dilemma over here, and the losses do not necessarily add to one another. In fact, they can cancel each other out. So if we discuss that, when one condition for an optimum is violated, then maintaining the other will not guarantee a second best solution. This is basically the theory of second best. But first, let us do the graphical analysis to explain the point of second best efficient solution. Now in this case, first there is a marginal private cost, and we are not considering any external cost over here, and marginal private cost is equal to marginal revenue, and the point of intersection is C, and the quantity being produced by the monopolist is QM. Now at that point, the price is being charged at point A, which is PM. Now you see that monopolist is producing a lesser amount of quantity which it should have been producing at Q star, and the government, in other words, which we discussed in the case of market failures in 1 or 2 lectures back, we discussed that government can either dissolve the monopoly, or government can also cause the monopoly to increase the quantity to Q star. Now let us see at this quantity what happens over here. Now since the monopoly is polluting, but at point B, Q star is fine. Q star is okay at point B, where MPC, or marginal private cost, is equal to marginal social benefit. Now as far as the monopoly area is concerned, we are safe as long as they produce at Q star. But now let us consider the negative externality inside it, or marginal external cost. Now let's assume that it is producing some amount of pollution whose marginal external cost, when added to marginal private cost, results into marginal social cost. So marginal private cost plus marginal external cost is equal to marginal social cost, and this would result into shifting of the curve to the left on towards upwards, and the new curve is represented by MPC plus MEC is equal to MSC, which is the marginal social cost. Now if the quantity is increased, let's assume we consider it a monopoly. We are not considering it right now a polluting monopoly, and we would ask it to increase the quantity as a government, and the monopolist increases the quantity to Q star. But then we find out that it is polluting in the environment. So at this point, it is producing a negative externality, which when accounted for is equal to the triangle area AFB, which is not efficient. So what we need to do again is to reduce it to the level where the point of intersection is represented by A. Now do you see that this point of intersection, A charging the price of PEM and producing the quantity of QM, was already the point which was represented by C. So monopolist was already producing at the point where we wanted to produce, considering that it is a monopolist and considering that it is creating a negative externality. So the two negative effects might not add up, but they are balancing out each other. The monopolist is automatically already, because it is a monopoly, it is already producing, it is at the point where it should be producing considering its negative externality. So now there are two solutions for the government. First solution is, considering that there is a cost involved in breaking up that monopoly, the first solution is that we incur that cost and the government breaks up that monopoly into a competition. Now let's assume that now it is a perfect competition producing at Q star, but still if it is producing at Q star, there is a negative externality involved with its production process. Then we would tax that. How we correct negative externality? By applying a tax, which we discussed in the last slide. When we tax that, we would reduce, we would increase its marginal private cost with a tax equal to marginal external cost, and that would increase its, that would shift the curve, and that would result into a lower quantity. So we go through that exercise and bring it back to the quantity where the monopolist was initially producing. And now, but the difference would be that it is no more a monopolist because we have broken up the monopoly. But still, we have brought it back to the same level of production. The second solution would be to leave the monopoly at its original place, since it is balancing out the negative externality out of its monopoly behavior. In this solution, there would not be any external costs, additional costs involved. So, in short, what was mentioned in the previous slide, when one condition for an optimum is violated, then maintaining the others will not guarantee a second best solution. So what economists would do is that they would look for, in certain cases, they would look for like other second best problems in such cases, and maybe the negative externality or the monopoly case would be balancing out each other. Now, after having a discussion on the taxes as correcting for externality, and then a case of choosing the second best option, a choice where there was a dilemma, like a monopoly causing inefficiency was also producing a negative externality, and the two effects would balance out each other. But generally it might be a case that the two effects do not balance out each other, because in this example we specifically made it like that the negative externality was exactly equal to the quantity being produced, and the QM was the efficient point already. But there might be a case in which QM might be above or below that efficient level, so in that case government might intervene to change the quantity. Then the third case would be a corrective subsidy, when there is a positive externality basically. Now what would be a positive externality would be, for example, the garbage collection by the government. When the government collects, makes it, for example, cantonment boards in Pakistan collect garbage from different locations of the city, and they charge very minimal amount for that, because the reason is that the marginal benefit out of that collection is a positive externality. Then there can be, in order to internalize that, there would be a tree plantation in which that would again be subsidized. Maybe the government can subsidize the tree plantation so that the environment is beautified. In both of these examples, that would be internalizing a positive externality by subsidizing certain activities. In first case, by subsidizing the collection of garbage, because that would satisfy, or that would create a better environment for the citizens, and in the second case that would beautify the environment, again benefiting the citizens in terms of marginal external benefit. The subsidy, setting the subsidy should be equal to marginal external benefit, which internalize the positive externality. Now let us see the same old example, but in this case in terms of a little bit different scenario. For example, the case of I hope you remember that the original equilibrium in case of vaccination injections being produced. On the x-axis there are inoculations per year in millions, and the original equilibrium is at 0.10 which is being produced, and then there is price, benefit and cost in terms of dollars on the y-axis. Now that is that point is at U, and the price being charged is $25. Now because there was a positive externality which was explained in detail like 2 or 3 times, that positive externality is that, for example, if you are being vaccinated, people around you would benefit from your vaccination because you are no more a potential carrier of that disease. So there would be a positive externality, marginal external benefit to all the individuals surrounding you who would not be affected by you in terms of as a carrier of a disease. So there is an externality equal that was given a dollar value equal to $20. Now if that dollar value is added into this, the price 25, to internalize it, it would be the total price would be $45 and at point Z. Now at this point the marginal social benefit, which is marginal private benefit of 25 plus the marginal external benefit of 20 is equal to the total social marginal benefit represented by D slash, and the curve would shift and the point would be Z and price would be 45. Now at this price the government can, in order to increase the quantity being produced, the government can subsidize the payments. Now the government can internalize this positive externality when the marginal private benefit is added with the marginal external benefit, which is $20, which is assumed to be $20. The demand curve shifts to the right. So marginal social benefit would be intersecting marginal social cost at point V, so because of increase in marginal cost due to excess production of 12 million, from 10 million to 12 million. So that would result into increase in the price of $30. Now in this case the government would subsidize equal to the marginal external benefit, that would be $20 per inoculation, and in this case the price for the consumers would reduce to $10, and as a result the total quantity being produced would be 12 million inoculations per year, and the society would benefit at large. The whole point of this is that the positive externality of external benefit to individuals can also be internalized by using a subsidy. In which case in this case was $20, and that $20 when added to marginal private benefits increased the demand, and towards the right increased the demand curve. The new point of intersection was V, and at this point of intersection the government would have the new price would be decided, which is $30, and at this new price the government needs to subsidize to ensure that $12 million is 12 million inoculations are produced per year. Now this would be approximately, since the government is paying a subsidy of $20 per inoculation, at 12 million inoculations it would approximately or exactly would be $240 million, which is represented by the rectangle R, V, X and Y, and this rectangle represents the total amount of subsidy that the government has to pay to subsidize the 12 million individuals who are taking those vaccinations, and in this way the market would be reaching an efficient point of production, resulting into efficiency in the whole system corrected by a subsidy. Now in this complete lecture we have we started from the externalities. Externalities are, as you remember, I hope, externalities are the marginal external cost and marginal external benefits that are not accounted for in the price. When two parties interact in terms of a transaction, the external the third party might be affected in terms of a cost or in terms of a benefit, and unless that cost or a benefit is actually incorporated into prices of the first and second party, that wouldn't be an externality. There are negative externalities and there are positive externalities. Now the negative externality would be, for example, pollution, which has an external cost to the third party. When the third party is affected in terms of external cost and that is not incorporated into the prices of the first and second party, that creates an efficiency in the system and they would be producing the quantity which is more than it should be produced. As a result, if the government intervenes in the system, they would tax the production of that quantity equal to the marginal external cost, and that would result into increase in the marginal social cost and marginal social benefit. And when marginal social cost is above or more than marginal social benefit, it is better to reduce the quantity, which exactly takes place when the tax is equal to the marginal external cost. Then we consider the case of the subsidy, which we just discussed. In the case of a subsidy, when there is like a positive externality in terms of vaccinations, for example, or in terms of fire alarms, or in all such cases, when there is a positive externality, there is an external benefit. In this case, there would be a subsidy by the government to incorporate that externality into the prices, and that would again cause the markets to be efficient. And the third case that we discussed was the most interesting one, when the monopoly was creating a negative externality. And there was a debate like between two choices, first or second choice. The monopoly was producing lower quantity and it needed to be increased. On the other hand, the monopoly was producing an externality that needed to be decreased. So if that the first option was that monopoly should be broken up into for example, maybe a perfect competition, and in that case, since that perfect competition is producing an negative externality, the result would be that we need to tax that negative externality to reduce the quantity that it produces, and then it brings it back to the same quantity that the monopoly was producing. So in other words, the second option would be to let the monopoly produce where it is, because it is balancing out the negative externality. So in this case, we actually saw certain cases where taxes, subsidies and government policies actually affect the market mechanism, and they can create efficiency in the system by correcting the failures or correcting the inefficiency in the systems. I hope you have acquired certain concepts out of this analysis. I hope that you view these slides again and go through them and try to explore them deeply, and hope to see you again. Thank you.